So at this point, I'm going to introduce our next panel, and we've invited 3 colleagues to come and share their work. And so I'll just say a little bit about, I'll introduce all 3 of them together, and then we'll invite them up. We'll hear from each of them, we'll have a conversation, and then we'd love to get you involved and hear your questions as well. So first, we will hear from Professor Pattie Maes, who's head of the Fluid Interfaces group here at the Media Lab. She's a longtime MIT faculty member, and as many of you know, she's a leading light in both human-computer interaction, but also more broadly, how we think about our relationships with technology. And for that, she's won a whole series of awards, including a Net Guru Award as a hidden hero who's shaping the future of technology. Fast Company named her as one of 50 most influential designers, and she's someone who always seems to be a little bit ahead of where the world is. And I have to say, Pattie, right now, like many people, I'm struggling with sleep. And so I'm really looking forward to you fixing that and your group fixing that soon. Maybe we'll hear a little more about that. Secondly, we're going to hear from Joshua Bennett, who's a professor here in literature at MIT. He's also distinguished chair of the Humanities. An absolutely incredible poet. Those of you who were at the opening session on Tuesday, we were taken on a journey that Joshua created an original poem for the kickoff of MIT Gen AI Week, but also his delivery of that poem was absolutely astonishing. His work's been published widely in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and several award-winning books of poetry as well. And he's, of course, in constant demand to share his poetry, so that includes performing at the White House for an evening of poetry and music that the Obamas sponsored. And then finally, we'll hear from Pelin Kivrak, who is a senior research associate with Refik Anadol Studio. And again, on Tuesday, we had a keynote where Refik kicked off by showing us the possibilities in art, and especially some of the new interfaces and interactive environments that his studio's been creating. And Pelin is trained classically in the humanities at Yale and Harvard. She's an author. She's also teaching at Tufts University nearby. But somehow, in addition to being a scholar, she's also working on these incredibly complex art pieces at scale all over the world. So we're going to have a chance to kind of lift the hood and learn a little bit more about that, and also where the future is in relation to art and creativity broadly. So please join me in welcoming all 3 of our panelists to the stage. Now, there's so much to talk about, but why don't we just kick things off by hearing from each of you individually. And so, Pattie, please come on up and share your thoughts with the group.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I want to start, actually, I need the clicker, that's one thing. I want to start by asking all of you a question. Do you see the glass half full or half empty when it comes to AI and human creativity in an era of abundant AI? So who's on the half full side? And who's on the half empty side? A few, well, the half full ones, as usual, I think at MIT, sort of see the future with technology as a little brighter. Personally, I think that our future, that AI, generative AI, will unleash a wealth of sort of human creativity, not just what people are already doing today, generating text, images, code, but also entire apps, videos, 3D models, printing them into objects, creating sounds, music, new drugs, new materials, new buildings, new cities, animated characters, new chatbots, AI agents, and entire new worlds and experiences. In fact, one of my students who you met earlier, Waldemar Danry, is doing an installation at the Contemporary Art Museum in Brussels, Beaux-Arts, called Be My Guest, where the entire experience of a dinner with a number of people will be created by AI. The plates, the food, in fact, the host at the dinner table will be an AI bot listening to the conversation and more. The music, everything is AI generated. So we can imagine things and then describe them and realize them. It's incredible. We can, unfortunately, it's not always yet working properly. I was trying to make a glass half full last night with Dali, and I just could not get there. And I kept saying, lower the amount of water, give me less water in the glass, it should be half full. And he kept insisting that it was much less than half full, even though it looks like that. So clearly, we still have some bumps in the road, some unresolved issues, no real understanding, clearly, no reasoning, hallucinations. These systems are always very full of, convincing and confident, but not always right. They have biases built in. The rights of the original human creators are not always being respected. Regulation and oversight is still non-existent. Legal issues aren't resolved. And last but not least, that will be the hardest one to solve. They have a huge cost on the environment. So nevertheless, we can go today from creating new molecules to creating entire worlds. But I think that what is sometimes the hardest for people to imagine and realize is reinventing themselves, changing ourselves, changing our attitudes, changing our confidence, our motivation, all of those sort of softer skills. And that's actually what I've been working on in my research group. So one of the projects, for example, is using deep fakes, a deep fake of a user themselves to help them imagine how they can be a more confident speaker. So you can decide who your favorite role model is, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez or whoever. You upload your own picture, and then you see yourself talking like your role model. And we've done studies in our group. We do these studies with large numbers of people, showing that when people see themselves talking confidently, they feel more confident themselves, and it actually changes their ability, their own ability to speak confidently. Similarly, we've done this with creativity. Sometimes this is talked about as the Proteus effect. Often we limit ourselves. We don't realize our full potential because we cannot imagine ourselves as confident speakers, as creative individuals. So we've been doing experiments where we actually turn people into a child version of themselves or into a crazy inventor version of themselves, and they actually come up with more creative ideas when they're a child or an inventor, and then they realize, that was me. I am that creative person, and it can actually unleash some of their own human creativity. Pat already talked about his project Machine of Multiple Me together with Walt Danry, where you can sort of get wisdom from other versions of yourself. Like, what if I was a little bit more older and mature, like the advisor, or maybe a little bit more feminine, not just in the way I look, but more importantly, in how I talk and what my opinions about things are. So in that project, he analyzes all the social media posts of an individual, and he can actually bias them and change them to be more like older or more feminine, etc., or it could be more left-wing, more right-wing, whatever you want, to sort of explore alternate selves and get input and wisdom from sort of other yous, basically. Related to that, he did a project to help people imagine their own future. This is very hard, I think, for young kids to think, and for all of us, to think long-term, to act in our long-term interests, not just for ourselves, but also for the planet, of course, etc. So he's been building a system called Future You, where you create an older version of yourself, and you say what you want, what you think you want to accomplish, and what your situation is, etc. And then it creates this older you that you can chat with, and you can ask, well, if you say, I think I want to become a biology teacher, then you can talk to your future self and say, do you think that worked out, being a having chosen that profession of a biology teacher? What are the good things? What are the bad things, etc.? And this is what ChatGPT and these large language models are so good at. They have all this information out there about people and their experiences that you can learn from. So we show with Hal Hirschfield, a psychologist at UCLA, that this actually changes people's attitudes and behavior towards the future. We're doing a future jobs for 18-year-olds where they can imagine themselves and talk to a future self that has a particular profession. And last, we're going beyond this by enabling people to talk to AI agents, to rehearse difficult conversations, to practice conflict resolution, etc. So this is Pat together with a student from Hiroshi's group called Daniel Pillis. They are building this system where you can rehearse a difficult conversation. Maybe it's coming out as gay to your parents, or how do I deal with conflict between two colleagues? How do I talk to someone who has very different values than me? And you can rehearse that and practice that with an agent or multiple agents playing roles, particular roles, like the role of your maybe conservative parents or something, and you can learn from that experience how to engage in these conversations. So for me, the glass is half full, similar to what Dali seemed to think. There's only half full glasses when it comes to unleashing human creativity with AI and really reimagining our world and ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Pattie. Wonderful. Please, Joshua.
Of course. How are y'all doing today? Y'all all right? Solid. I come from a performance poetry background, so you always got to do a temperature check in the room before you say anything on the microphone. So thank you again to my colleagues on the panel for the invitation. My name is Joshua Bennett. I'm a poet, a literary critic, and as of 4 weeks ago, a father of 2. So if anything, wow, that's incredible. There really is a great vibe here at MIT about the celebration of new life. So if anything I say here is a bit blurry, it's because the past couple weeks have been a blur in the best possible way. So here at the Institute, I'm primarily a teacher of both literary criticism and the literary arts. And so I hope my talk today really reflects those kind of twin impulses and longstanding commitments. In that spirit, I want to open with an epigraph from one of my favorite writers. Oh. Every sound we make is a bit of autobiography. It's from the Canadian poet and translator, Anne Carson. Act 1, property. So this talk began as a telephone conversation with my literary agent, Nate, about a new book we'd been working on together, a cultural history of Black prodigies across the world. Nate mentioned that he was finalizing our contract with the publisher and that they had just added a no AI clause to it earlier that week. No doubt hearing the confusion embedded in the half beat after he uttered this phrase, Nate then clarified a bit. Essentially, the agency had argued for additional language in the contract to ensure that no AI software could be used to record the audiobook for this latest project in my place. After this conversation with Nate, I decided to figure out how other authors were managing these sorts of questions around AI and authorship. During that search, I came across the following article in The Atlantic. These 183,000 books are fueling the biggest fight in publishing and tech. So embedded in this article, as you can see right there, is a search tool that you can use to find out which specific books have been used as training data for Meta's large language models. Naturally, I searched for the names of a handful of writers I know, and then, obviously, my own. And there it was. My first book of poems written in graduate school, of all places, as I was sleeping on a futon. The Sobbing School, used to train an LLM without my knowledge or permission. In that moment, I wasn't exactly sure how to feel, but I soon realized that I needed a more robust historical frame to help me better understand and ultimately contribute to the conversations now taking place in my community of writers, some way to help us navigate this new environment where we were discovering that our work had been used in this strange and unexpected fashion. In the dominant framing of this discourse, after all, AI is often imagined as a cheaper, more efficient option for companies interested in literary text as a saleable commodity. Here, there's no mandate to pay for studio time or depend on the labor of audio engineers and voice actors. No need to account for an author showing up late to a recording session or else going through multiple takes to perfect a reading. Only the faintest echo of a human element remains. Fittingly, in my work on prodigies, I'd already been thinking about this larger question of the human voice, not only as a part of one's personhood, but as a site of real social and political struggle. I was already writing, for instance, about the enslaved teenage poet Phyllis Wheatley, who in October 1772 was asked to sit before a panel of 18 lawmakers and scholars right here in Massachusetts, each of whom was tasked with determining whether it was truly possible that she had composed the poetry published under her name. They simply couldn't imagine, at least at first, that she had produced such a luminous literary voice. I want to mention, too, if you notice, this book was published in London the year after. And if you look at those earliest reviews of Wheatley's book, there's this tension built into them. They say, well, if she can write so beautifully, how can she be enslaved? If we know that she has this rich interior life and she's not just a machine, how can it be possible that we keep up this global system? Okay. And then, of course, there was Aretha Franklin. And if you ever see anybody make that face in front of a microphone, you know it's about to go down. And Stevie Wonder, my father's favorite singer, both prodigiously gifted vocalists since childhood, whose voices had been honed by the institutions that raised them, places like the New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit, the Michigan School for the Blind, and Motown Records. All spaces that were grounded in some sense by the idea that the humanity of the people within their walls was not negotiable, and that each of them had something wonderful to offer the world. In sharing this newest work with you all then, I wanted to emphasize a series of these sorts of vignettes throughout history, taken from the tradition I love and study, and animated by this debate over the human voice as an essential part of one's personhood. On this front, I have 3 core questions. In what sense and in what situations do our voices belong to us? What properties can be said to constitute the content of one's own voice in the first place? And what historical models exist to help us navigate present-day debates around the use of AI to alter, replicate, or stand in for the human voice in the arts and entertainment world? Act 2, Prodigies. Let's begin in 1963 with the King versus Mr. Maestro Incorporated case, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sued the 20th Century Fox Record Corporation for selling recordings of his I Have a Dream speech as a spoken word LP. And I should mention here that King was also a prodigy, went to college at 16 years old, for those of you who don't know, and in the early 20s moved here to Boston to study at BU for seminary. So it's important to remember that I Have a Dream was actually recorded earlier this year in '63 at the March on Washington, which is depicted here. But at that time, there was no federal copyright protection for sound recordings. That became a reality in 1972 following the passage of the Sound Recording Act of 1971. In this era, only one sort of copyright was applicable to LPs, those covering textual content, the words and nothing more. It also bears mentioning that this kind of issue comes up almost 40 years later when King's estate has to sue Columbia Records in the case of the estate of Martin Luther King versus CBS, a legal dispute which emerges because Columbia refuses to pay royalties to his estate after using I Have a Dream in a documentary series, 20th Century with Mike Wallace. In the decision of King versus Mr. Maestro Incorporated, the court found that Dr. King had developed a unique literary and oratorical style, and that it seems unfair and unjust for defendants to use the voice and the words of Dr. King without his consent and for their own financial profit. According to the court then, King's words and his voice are inextricable from one another. They operate together under the banner of style, and it is precisely this style, this dance between text and audible sound, that makes the recording valuable as protectable intellectual property. Okay? And quickly, I just want to share one more vignette dealing with the empress of the blues herself, Bessie Smith. So in the case of Guy versus CBS Incorporated, the heirs of Bessie Smith, okay, her adopted son and the executor of her late husband's estate, William D. Harris, essentially tried to take Columbia Records to court for the fact that she never received a royalty payment in her entire life, right? This despite having sold hundreds of thousands of records while she was alive. They also, after her death, had been circulating re-recordings with her face on the book jacket, and it was found that basically her managers had been exploiting her for the entirety of her life. It's a quotation from the president of Columbia Records when asked to address this on live television. He essentially said a single royalty payment had been made to the Bessie Smith Foundation and that the rest of the money would be used on occasion to pay for scholarships for needy Black students, okay? Not repair, just infrastructure, let's say. Act 3, promise. So in closing, I'm curious about how we might create models of not only compensation, but collaboration that honor the spirit of the arguments put forward by this chorus of ancestral American artists, but also contemporary ones as well. What models might we have already? Sampling, for instance, which, however imperfect, emphasizes 3 principles that I think are useful here. Crate digging, which is a kind of archival exploration, clearance, going through proper legal channels to gain permissions, and collaboration, thoughtful connection across time and space. Can we press play on this tiny TikTok window, please?
Cool J is hard as hell. Battle anybody, I don't care. You.
Hey, girl.
Does anybody recognize these samples yet? Okay, we got a couple hands in the audience.
Ugh, nasty.
All my life I want money and power, respect my mind.
All right. So that, of course, is Backseat Freestyle from none other than the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and MC Kendrick Lamar, okay? And if you know that song, you know he also starts with the line, Martin had a dream, Kendrick has a dream. So there's a kind of double citation happening here that I think is really beautiful. And ultimately, I think there's a kind of sociality and togetherness built into sampling that we can reflect back onto this moment, right? Because when we sample, when we riff and cite and cover, we assemble an ensemble of the people we admire and the beautiful sounds they made, right? We built a home for them in the present with the materials they left behind for us. We call their voices in that they might lift us higher. Thank you.
Incredible. Thank you, Joshua. And please, Pelin.
Hi, everyone. I'm here today as the senior researcher at Refik Anadol Studio. Refik unfortunately had to leave last night to install our studio's most recent artwork at the Climate Change Summit COP28 in Dubai, but he sends his regards. And I have to say that after spending 2 great days at this impeccable conference, he had a really hard time leaving last night. And no, I did not prompt ChatGPT-4 to write this presentation in his voice, but I will try to represent our studio's collective vision of generative AI art as much as I can today. I'm here as the person behind the conceptual and academic research at the studio, but I also want to add that I'm a comparative literature scholar by training. And even though I work at an AI studio where we use the most cutting-edge technological tools, I still write all my notes by hand. So I'm eagerly anticipating the discussions that will unfold in this panel today. I'd like to start by briefly introducing our art and research practice at Refik Anadol Studio in Los Angeles. We're based in Los Angeles. And while I do that, I'm going to start showing a 5-minute video that showcases most of our major works from the past decade. I'd be more than happy to discuss them in detail later if anything sparks your interest. I've been part of the studio since before its inception because Refik and I started working together while we were college students. So I'm in a position to talk about most of these artworks. Please feel free to reach me after the presentation because today I simply don't have time to go into detail even though I really want to. So I'm going to start the presentation. As a studio, we have always been intrigued by the ways in which new computational methods and artificial intelligence allow for a new aesthetic to create enriched, immersive, and dynamic environments. Our first explorations, as our signature style shows, entailed a heightened engagement with different softwares and data visualization tools in order to transform data into pigmentation and embed immersive arts into architecture. Our creations navigate the intersection of virtual and physical spaces, fostering a symbiotic relationship between science and media arts through AI and machine intelligence. We've been pioneers in collaborating with AI to create entirely new forms of multisensory art using not only visual data sets, but also sound and scent. Our commissions, almost always created in collaboration with cultural or research institutions around the world, have been exhibited worldwide. Our data paintings and sculptures, real-time performances, and immersive art installations take many forms, while encouraging the audience to rethink our engagement with the physical world, collective experiences, public art, and the creative potentials of AI. What was once invisible to the human eye, but still born out of human or nature-centric data, becomes visible in our artworks. One could say a digital sublime is created with almost overwhelming amount of data. For one of our most recent AI data paintings, unsupervised at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, we posed an alternate understanding of modern art by transforming the metadata of MoMA's collection into a work that continuously generates new forms in real time. It was recently welcomed into the permanent collection of the museum. For Walt Disney Concert Hall Dreams, which you will see running in the background, back in 2018, we used the century-long institutional archives and recordings of the LA Philharmonic to create visuals projected onto the iconic building in downtown LA. While the data sets we have been working with have represented diverse human actions in designated urban, public, and architectural spaces, we began experimenting with nature-related data sets more during the pandemic. We began by collecting publicly available data sets of flora, California landscapes, and corals, simply because we wanted to connect more with nature and wanted to see how the machine would interpret real pigments and shapes found in nature. Over time, and closely following the advancements in generative AI, the research part of our work became more and more embedded in creating the digital ecologies and ecosystems. So we have embarked on a project that intertwines nature with the vast potential of generative AI, a project that we call a large nature model, LNM, a venture that stands out from other generative AI models in the way in which it is based on visuals, sounds, and movements of nature. One side of our research is deeply embedded in creating dialogues between institutions that hold large nature data sets and make them part of a generative AI model to be able to see the previously unseen connections in their archives. We're doing so by very transparently crediting their research with the names of all the scientists involved in the research. But when we started realizing the dream of building this model, we were also closely monitoring the ethical debates around data collection methods and generative AI. And that productive challenge inspired us to commit to a really hard but valuable methodological perspective, which is to collect our own data set as opposed to using publicly available images that are not institutionally or personally protected. Our team's dedication to this ideal has led us deep into the heart of 16 rainforests around the world. We have taken a hands-on approach, scanning and collecting an exhaustive range of species and nature images, and sounds and scents. So with that note, I would like to end my presentation with two simple discussions, open-ended questions, or provocations, if you will, that emerge out of some of the internal discussions that we have in our practice. And I would love to discuss them further if they resonate with your creative practices as well. One of them has to do with the slight modification of the phrase, using AI to create art. I would argue that what we're doing, at least in our studio in LA, is using AI to see the world differently and then create art. And this is not simply to reduce AI to a tool, but to delegate it to a multidirectional gray area where artistic creation happens in the light of our various perceptions of the world across time and space. And secondly, the digital humanities scholar inside me could not help but do a distant reading of how many times the word trust came up during the first day of the symposium. But the close reader, literary scholar inside me, almost wants to argue that our creative interactions with AI could be the only place where we could exercise a willing suspension of disbelief, as we do when reading fiction, for example, in order to drive pleasure out of the process of engaging with an alternative reality and recognizing its faults and imperfections in order to shed light on our daily lives. Maybe that very human pleasure, intertwined with a critical lens, is something we can trust. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, absolutely brilliant. Is exactly what I was hoping each of you would do. And perhaps we could begin with fostering a little bit of conversation between the three of you. So any immediate reactions to each other's talks or anything? I mean, you've each given us a different lens and very important questions you're raising. So would anyone like to address someone else's talk or respond to any of the other questions posed? Please, Pattie.
Maybe I can suggest a topic to talk about, which came up in both of your talks, namely where the data come from and honoring and respecting sort of who created that original data that ultimately we're benefiting from. And I think, Joshua, you gave a great example of how in music with sampling, it's more like honoring people that came before and by referencing them, but I feel that we're not doing the same thing with AI, or it's people don't know that it was based on your poetry, maybe a poem that they generate and so on. So it seems that it would be great to think about how we could not just respect the creators' rights and not have their data trained on and their art work trained on if they don't want to be part of it, but second, also giving reference and honoring people and making it explicit whose art the creations were based on, basically. Yeah.
And that's a very fine line, right? Because if it's a small piece, that is honoring, but if it's appropriating a large piece, that feels like stealing.
You lifted it, right?
Yeah.
Lifted.
No, but I love what you're saying, though, because to me it sounds actually not like it forecloses collaboration, but that it's an opportunity for collaboration. I mean, a number of us who were circulating on Instagram, these kind of screenshots, and we'd found ourselves in the database. I mean, I think it was a Janus-faced moment, right? On the one hand, it's like, yeah, they stole my book. Like, I need a check today, right? But there's also this sense that, okay, well, I mean, if you look at that image from the search bar, it's like Baldwin, Pynchon. I mean, so there actually is already this kind of editorial process happening behind the scenes where they're trying to train the voice of this large language model. And what I'm trying to imagine is how do we all become a part of that, right? If the technology is going to proceed apace, how do we construct an ethics around that and not let the tech keep speeding on ahead of us before we answer these foundational questions? And I think all of us were getting at that in really interesting ways at the level of imagery too. And I love what you said about the suspension of disbelief on this front, right? That's an ethical question, I think, especially for our children and our young people, right? To teach them that it's fiction and not a little person in the screen talking back to them.
Yeah. I mean, going back to the generative AI model being this mysterious space where we cannot penetrate, as Caitlin put it aptly this morning. That was our initial reaction to this idea of, not being able to see where the data is coming from. And this is very interesting, but the first thing that we did when we realized that we wanted to change that infrastructure as much as we can at our studio was to simply call people at research institutions and talk to them. Going back to that earlier modes of collaboration, and it paid off. We started collaborating with a lot of institutions across the US, and we're building this data set with their help. And we're constantly in touch as humans on Zoom, seeing each other, talking about the data set. And that turned out to be the most valuable aspect of building this model, actually.
Very good. And I think fundamentally in all of this, there's a question about, as Rod Brooks said in his keynote the other day, imitation versus innovation, right? You're training on existing models, existing data sets, human voices, unique lived human experiences, and you cannot arrive at the voice of Toni Morrison without being Toni Morrison. And yet today, high school kid can say, write my college application essay in the voice of Toni Morrison, and it can spit it out immediately. And then our poor colleagues in admissions have to try to figure out what to do with that. And so I guess I'd like to also ask about this question of innovation. And Pattie, I think in your work, you've taken a wonderful example for us, because you use what models are good at to project into the future. So you kind of turn that into a benefit, but how do you think about that interplay between imitation and innovation?
Yeah, I personally, I think that these models are not truly innovating. They are interpolating, basically.
Exactly.
And, but I see all of these AI systems as tools. I mean, ultimately, you still have to give it a prompt, and for anyone here who has played with these systems, it's actually really hard to make them do what you want, and you end up editing things, whether it's in Photoshop or editing the text or whatever. So it's more like the AI sort of is a seed. Whatever the system comes up with is a seed that then the person can respond to, that it's like co-creation, and I believe that human plus AI can come up with really novel things, but not necessarily AI by itself. I'm getting very tired of AI images by now, because they all look the same. It's so predictable. So I think it will push human creativity to a higher level, where we have to create things where people say, whoa, that's authentic. That's very different from any of this AI crap. Yeah.
Pattie, can you actually...
Please.
Can you say a bit more about human flourishing? And it's part of what struck me so much about your presentation, that seems to be clearly your end of the philosophical debate about what it's for. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that larger debate kind of developing from your sense of things, both within your own team and beyond?
I think that, well, all of us are very much influenced by, of course, our upbringing and schooling and the family where we grow up and so on. And so, yeah, what I like about AI, sort of what draws me to it, is that it can be a tool really to reimagine ourselves and to imagine our possibilities. Like, I feel that I wasn't necessarily a super creative person when I arrived at MIT, but being in this environment, I started seeing myself as a creative person, and then that sort of, you start then acting that way as well. So I really believe it can sort of, show people that they are not necessarily stuck with whatever they grew up with and sort of a very biased society and so on, that they can see their own potential. That's one of the things that motivates me. Yeah.
And Michael was very, very clear about that this morning. There's so much human talent in the world that's not reaching its potential because perhaps it cannot. That 13-year-old cannot see themselves in that role, and it's part of all of our duty to help enable that. Any other thoughts among the panel? And we are going to open it to the floor in just a few minutes, so please have your questions ready. But any other thoughts among yourselves? I could always, of course, ask more questions, but...
I was actually thinking about maybe your thoughts about this, about redefining creativity. Is it necessary? And where would you locate yourself in that debate? Do we need to redefine creativity now that we have new tools? Is it possible to be creative without imagination? I know it's a big question.
No, it's a good question. I don't know that we know what it is.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, ask a poet.
We never knew.
Yeah, ask a poet where a poem comes from. Right?
Yeah.
W.S. Merwin would say it's when a sequence of words begins to pick up an electrical charge. It's very pretty, but it's not totally clear, right?
Yeah.
And it's because the process itself is not clear.
Yeah.
It's magic to us, right? If you talk to great playwrights and singers, they'll tell you the same thing.
Somewhat painful, I think, at times.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
My friends who are novelists, they just lay down on the floor sometimes for weeks at a time when they're in the throes of putting the plot together. But that difficulty is also part of the beauty. It's part of the dance. And so, I mean, part of why I think I even wanted to frame my talk that way was I think what we need is, we need sort of ways to figure out how to marshal more materials, more supports to people who don't currently have the material resources to engage their creativity at full tilt, right? We need to figure out, I mean, here at the Institute, I come up against this all the time. Students who say, well, I don't actually know how to even get in the mindset to write a poem. No one has ever asked me to write a poem before. How do I get, what are the rules? Right? I spent 4 weeks on rules, right? Not the rules of a poem, but getting around the discourse of rules in poetry to say, well, when you just sit still in a quiet room, what comes to you? Trust that.
Yeah. I do think that AI will train us to follow our intuition more. It's part of, I think it's part of the system that is forcing us to listen to ourselves more, to decide whether something is authentic or not, what it feels like to us when we're confronted by it. So, yeah.
And I would really like to think that it will help us to question our educational models.
Sure. Yeah.
And how are we, you know, how do you develop young people's potential? And, you know, it's not memorizing world capitals necessarily or learning dates of historical figures necessarily, but it's more learning about lived experiences. And so that's very compelling, Pattie, in your lab's work and all of the work that all of you shared. Okay, well, maybe at this point we could open it up to the floor. And if you do have a question, we have 2 microphones here. So please come up to the microphone. Please introduce yourself. You've generated so much interest. So please try to keep the questions brief, and we'll try to keep the answers brief. And you don't all have to respond to each question. But why don't we begin right here?
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for this. One thing that struck me in your speech, or all your talks, was the idea of this large nature model, and how you felt it was more ethical to go and collect that data yourself. I'm just wondering about all of you, could you speak to the idea of how open data sets and maybe the idea of Creative Commons may be changed or affected or impacted as we think about creativity and using this information in what we build?
Well, I can start. As I said earlier, we were mainly frustrated by the fact that the existing models were not penetrable. Like we could not see the workings of the model, and that was the intention behind building our own model to begin with. As for the data sets, we've been using publicly available visuals and sounds to create some of the artworks that I showed you, and that idea became something that we started questioning as well with all the ethical debates that we've been reading. Because our research practice not only focuses on generative AI studies, but also ethical AI. So we've been reading a lot about people's reactions to their works being used to train a model. And we wanted to offer an alternative by bringing in different voices to help us build that model. And luckily, we had opportunities to actually get sponsorships to travel to those places. We're still building the model. We're not sure whether it's going to be one of those influential models in the end. I'm going to be really humble here, but yeah. So in the process of building it, we're really, really reflecting on ethical data collection methods. And at this point, since it's not public yet, it feels great when we're working on a model to know that we physically collected this data. But if that feeling is going to turn into a movement or an influential model, we don't know yet. Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful that you've sort of, with the studio, moved towards really collecting your own data from scratch. But of course, that is also an expensive sort of thing to do. But I think one thing that we should push for is for all of these models that people use as tools to be more open about what data things are trained on, what data has gone into these models, so that you can know what to expect, what biases also you can expect, and so on. And it's a bit frustrating that not all of the big companies out there, or most of them, are very private now about what data were used.
That transparency seems critical, especially for academics. We have so many questions. I'd love to keep moving, if that's okay. We'll go to this side.
A great session as part of a great conference. So I just want to push a little bit on this question about the limits of property rights and the role of the commons. I'm reminded of the discussions we had in around about 2000 with Lawrence Lessig and the kind of Disney cases for the Supreme Court there, which you're really pushing on the importance of commons of various forms in kind of cultural artifacts. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on how we come to a reasoned balance between those two. Thank you.
Certainly, yeah, in community. I think in the community with artists who are creating the work. I mean, we already have a great amount of work in the public domain that I think could be used to help train these systems if we have an expansive eye. And I mean, it's important mentioning too that Bessie Smith's heirs lost that case, right? King won his case, Bessie Smith lost hers. And in the kind of dialogue that I've been in with this case law over time, it struck me that this question of the commons is opened up over and over again. And people have said several times that a voice is not copyrightable, right? Voices change over time, right, for one thing. And is your voice, the unique sound of it or the words, right? And so this is an open question, I think. But the commons are, of course, absolutely key. But we still need to expand the commons. I mean, this question of gathering your own data, I think it's important because the end product is not inherently more important than the process through which you get there, right? And I think holding those things in tension is actually what's needed philosophically at this moment.
Yeah, very good. Okay, maybe we'll keep going. Next question. Thank you, Joshua.
Hi. First, I want to say thank you to the panel and MIT. I consider myself very fortunate to be here and hearing all of this. My son goes to a school called the Carroll School, which is, for dyslexic kids. And when he started there, the ex-head of the school asked me to read a book called In the Mind's Eye by a professor named West. And it was the premise of the book is that visual learners, dyslexics, are predisposed to all the advances in technology. Now, I read the book. It's not the easiest book to get through, but very interesting. Till this week, I didn't get it. And so listening to all of you talking about examples that you've all made about visuals and how that's part of AI and advancing it, so I got to ask the question, is it correct, that premise, that dyslexics are uniquely, have the unique skills as we move into this time, as the book says, of visual learning? So I know I'm a little self-interested in asking it, but there are a lot of us out there.
Well, I might preface this by saying you may not have expertise in dyslexia, but I think all of us are educators, and clearly there are many different learning styles. But please, anyone want to tackle that question?
Well, I would say that even before AI became so popular, we are moving gradually towards a world where visuals are more important. So I think that's one of the wonderful things that is happening today, that if a kid is not good at just absorbing knowledge or whatever through text, there are now totally different forms that you can use. Like Pat, my student Pat showed his Leonardo. Instead of reading Leonardo's journals, you can talk to him and ask him to illustrate things from his journals. Maybe some of you will think that that's not the same thing, or that the voice is not authentic, although we try to make sure that it only says things that Leonardo actually wrote. But it's sort of a more interactive and possibly more engaging way to absorb some of that material.
Yeah, the book on prodigies has become a book about giftedness and largely a book about teaching deaf and blind children in the segregated South, somehow. I pitched it as a book on prodigies, it got picked up, and then it turned into that. And so I've been thinking a lot about disability education, and especially this frame of giftedness, and how the way I learned to think about giftedness in both a kind of elite New York City private school setting and high school, but first in this experimental independent school in Harlem called the Modern School, where we put on plays and we painted and we played outside all the time, and our parents were heart surgeons and janitors and came from a whole constellation of professional backgrounds. I learned at a very early age that there was something about this thing called giftedness that had nothing to do with a score on a piece of paper. Right? It had nothing to do with the metrics that I inherited later in life that would tell me I was smart or beautiful or creative. And so what I hope, and sounds like I'm hearing from you, and good on you for reading the books that you know that your kid is reading. That's a practice I'm getting into, and it's a beautiful thing. But it sounds like you already have that sense, right? That we all have our distinct minds, and that a gift is something you give away. Nobody else can determine it for you. And so what I hope is that at its best, this new technology will be used to reach the most expansive group of kids possible, and that'll inherently have kids with disabilities in it. It'll have kids who've been told they're unchosen and don't fit anywhere in it. And so that's one of my biggest and best dreams for what we can do with this.
Beautiful. Okay, maybe we'll keep going. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hey there.
Hi.
So thank you for the talk. It was fantastic. I also had the opportunity on Tuesday to see Refik's keynote, and it was fascinating. And it leads me to this question that I had since then. So songwriters, book writers, artists, creators in general, often state their inspiration, some elements that they inspire from to create their own creations. If we pass this to the AI domain, it's often more complicated to tag these differences, because in human creation, if that inspiration is taken further, it's plagiarism, it borders plagiarism. I feel that we're not ready to tag correctly what is AI imitation, what is AI innovation. So whether it's with the current technology or with the technology that will come in the future, and I'm talking now maybe AI sentience, real innovation from AI, are we ready to tag that correctly?
Anyone?
I think that will always be an open question where you define that boundary. I think that's already the case in music, for example, that there are lawsuits. I mean, musicians are always borrowing from other musicians, and like in jazz, for example, that's what it's all about, almost referencing others and so on. And but then we're constantly arguing over where that boundary is of standing on the shoulders of others versus stealing. Yeah.
Anyone else? Maybe we'll try to get through these last three questions if we can, since you're all been standing patiently, so please.
I'll be brief. My name is Lawrence. I'm out here also visiting from California, where we just had the writers' strike end, which was very painful, and a big point in that was saying no to AI. I think that you all here, this day has been fascinating in showing the capacity for AI to open doors to our higher selves. But when there's the corporate powers that have the keys to the car, they don't always rise to their higher selves. I mean, Pelin, you talked about this kind of kind collaboration among your colleagues. How can you or we all as the leaders in this industry implore or help the corporate folks who have the most capacity to make the most money do the right thing, not do what we see with Smith versus Columbia?
That's
a big question.
A big question, not just for art and creativity, but for AI in general. I mean, AI is defined as by Turing over 60 years ago as surpassing human intelligence, and the whole sort of goal of the whole research field is to ultimately be better, make something that can do more than people. And unfortunately, I think that's unfortunate, there's always been sort of another movement which is about augmenting people and supporting people in being creative in everything, in intelligence, with people like Engelbart and Licklider and so on. But unfortunately, the ones that are sort of about, like, let's compete with people and be better, have sort of are dominating right now, rather than the movement that is trying to support human intelligence and augment human intelligence. And
I'd like to respond by maybe talking about something philosophical about creativity, but then again, from a tangible perspective. If you define creativity as simply creating something new, then AI can be creative and it can replace any human, right? But if your definition of creativity is creating something new and valuable, then I think we all have some responsibility to make sure that that something valuable does not intersect or destroy human values that we already have. So that would be a good perspective, I think, going forward in terms of making ethical decisions around AI implementation.
Yeah. And I would just say quickly, I think you all are already doing it. You went on strike, right? And you didn't take the argument just to the bosses, you took it to the public.
Yeah.
And I think a bunch of us said, oh, wait, this entire industry is underfunded. People can't feed themselves or support their families. I don't love movies just because they're beautiful. I love movies and television because people made it.
Yeah.
Right? And like, as my friend Tango says, like, politics mean people did it and people do it. And I think, film, art is a similar kind of thing. So I don't know how much advice you need from us. Like, you took the labor power in your hand, and you said, but I think it's really important, right? You made it a public argument, right? You made them say, okay, you want to have no background actors ever? You want to fill that with computer-generated bodies? And I think a bunch of us said, yeah, dude, that's sick. That sucks. I don't want to watch that.
And a human.
And so you won the hearts and minds of people, but I think going right to the human core of the thing itself.
Exactly. Okay, we're almost out of time. Just very quickly.
Hello. I'm Akash, co-founder of an AI company. I'm a statistician. They say that stories come from, they ask the question, where do stories come from? And they answer, stories come from other stories, including the author's individual opinion about the society and the time in which he is living, also dependent on other authors that he's inspired with. This whole process of combining whatever inspires an author is, you can define that as imagination. So if that is the definition, historical, canonical definition of imagination, what AI is doing, conjoining, combining in interesting ways of other stories, is essentially impacting this industry more than any other industry. I don't see AI coming up with new mathematical theorems, but AI can come up with stories which mimics an author's imaginative process. If that is the case, how do you define imagination for an author today?
Joshua, would you like to take
as
the poet in residence?
I mean, this is complicated because I've tried to use a number, Bard, ChatGPT, the whole thing, and it doesn't swing.
Yeah.
So, like, this is someone raised by musicians and writers and actors. It does not aspire toward the sound of Whitney Houston's voice, right? Or Toni Morrison or August Wilson or James Baldwin. It doesn't even approximate or approach it. And we could say maybe it will in 5 years, maybe in 10 years. But I don't even know what that would mean, in part because I think the thing that sparks my joy and interest when I read those books is the sense of another consciousness across time that I'm connected to, a real human person. To me, that's imagination. Like, imagination comes from a human being. We're not prediction machines. We are listeners, right? We take our influence from everywhere, but we're not just predicting what the next word in the sentence will be based on all the sentences we've heard, right? We're playing. It's jazz. We're playing in open air, and we're riffing on one another. And I just feel like that's a distinction we want to hold on to, in part so AI can become something more beautiful, actually. To say, yeah, imagination is our work. This is a tool we use in the service, maybe, of human imagination. But let's work out those orbits and let them be what they are.
May we please stop there? That was just fabulous.
Yeah, that was amazing.
It doesn't swing. There's your answer.
I love that.
Please join me in thanking this amazing panel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so to wrap things up now, there is, of course, an additional afternoon symposium on the AI in the future of commerce, impact of commerce. And David, there's so much we could say, but I just want to say thanks to you and to the Media Lab for having us here. We hope all of you enjoyed the morning. Boy, do we have a lot to think about.
We have a lot to think about. This is the beginning of the discussion with all of you. Thank you for coming to MIT, joining our Gen AI Week. And John, I want to thank you, the Morningside Academy of Design, the Media Lab students, the MAD students, all the MIT students who joined us and inspire us every day. Patty, thank you for so much for organizing all the students, working with us. And boy, to our panelists, something special.
Panelists and students, we're so grateful to everyone who participated. And if you want to meet a human dinosaur AI mashup, Pat's right here in the front row. So thank you all again for being here. Have a great day.
Thanks, Betty.